All right, so Rosendahl is asking me to fill the time. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to introduce the program that we have today and introduce our panelists, and then they'll come out, we'll sit down, we'll get started. We're going to talk for a while. We'll take your questions. This will be the grand finale of this great conference. Once again, give Rosendahl a big hand for what he put together here. All right. So I am Evan Smith. I am pleased to welcome our four distinguished guests to Austin, folks I really like and especially admire. Excellent journalists, all carefully chosen and perfectly suited to answer the question that is the premise of this session's title. What is it like to cover the first truly online president? In our lifetimes, journalism has surely changed and politics has surely changed. The art and science of being a political reporter has surely changed. And the both sides of the ball aspect of being a political figure covered by the press, the offense and the defense, has surely changed. God knows the White House and its relationship with the press has surely changed. Whether merely for now or forever remains to be seen. Sitting squarely at the center of the confluence of these changes is Donald Trump, who always wants us to talk about him, and so we will. What does his utilizing, or some would say weaponizing, of the online space to conduct the serious business of the United States mean for the work we all do and for the public we all serve? That is our question today. So let me introduce our panelists. We'll have them come out all together and we'll sit. Yamiche Alcindor is the White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. She is also an NBC News and MSNBC contributor. She came to the NewsHour. Yeah, come on up. Have you sit right there? Good. She came to the NewsHour from the New York Times, where she was a national reporter writing about social issues and politics, particularly the intersection of race and politics. A native of Miami, she has an undergraduate degree from Georgetown University and a master's degree from New York University. Kimberly Atkins is a senior news correspondent for WBUR, Boston's NPR station, reporting on national political news from Washington, D.C. She, too, is an MSNBC contributor. Previously, she was Washington bureau chief of the Boston Herald. A native of Detroit, she's a graduate of Wayne State University, Boston University's School of Law, Boston University's School of Communications, and Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Jonathan Lemire is White House reporter for the Associated Press and an NBC News and MSNBC political analyst. He's covered Donald Trump all the way back to June 2015 and the Trump Tower kickoff. He previously spent more than a decade as a reporter at the New York Daily News, covering the 2012 presidential campaign, City Hall, and the 9/11 attacks. He is a native of Lowell, Massachusetts, and a graduate of Columbia University. Finally, Eli Stokols, who is White House reporter for the Los Angeles Times and an MSNBC political analyst. He previously covered the Trump administration and the 2016 presidential election for the Wall Street Journal. He's also been a reporter at Politico. He's a native of Irvine, California, has an undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Please welcome our distinguished guests. Give them a big hand. Good. Thank you all for being here very much. So let's begin this unintentional meeting of the Columbia University Alumni Association. Yamiche and I are left out of this, sadly. By asking you all whether the job has turned out the way you expected. Substantively, what you cover and practically how you cover it. Is it different, Eli, from how you thought it would be?
Well, this is the first time I've been a White House reporter, so I didn't cover the Obama administration, the Bush administration, like some of the colleagues who we work with at the White House.
But you covered him.
I have a suspicion that what we're doing with this administration is a little different than what our predecessors experienced in terms of the way the days play out and the sort of yes, it's different than any other White House before. But having covered the campaign, having followed Donald Trump, it's about what you expect in terms of the complete lack of process internally. The fact that you can try to report around and figure out what he's going to do, but at this point. Maybe at the beginning, advisors would say, oh yeah, he's going to do this, he's getting out of the Paris Accords, and it would come true, or sometimes it wouldn't. We're at a point now where you talk to most people and they say, I think he's going to do this, but I don't really know. It is very much an imperial presidency now, much like his businesses were. Right. This is a guy who just has a very small circle around him, doesn't trust anybody, wants to be the focus, and that's how the that's how this administration runs.
Yeah.
And I think that, on election night 2016, when we realized he was going to win, I think most of us were surprised.
There's really no there's no playbook, Kim, right, for that. I mean, the fact is, Eli says imperial presidency. We also hear chaos presidency. And in some ways, this has been chaos journalism, has it not, for the last 2 years?
Yes, because the major way that it's different, in my experience, is you could sort of get into a rhythm covering other administrations from the White House on down. I mean, I've covered, from school boards all the way up, and each one, you sort of understand it. You get into a rhythm. You understand how things are going to play out. You could you could do things like plan your week. In a way that with this presidency, you absolutely cannot, because you don't know what's coming one day to the next. One of the fundamental differences about this administration, covering it as a journalist, that I found is that in the past, I realize now I could take for granted some certain things. Like I could take for granted that information that I got from the White House, unless there was some glaring reason to believe that it wasn't true, was true. I could do things like look at a transcript that was provided and not question it. In a way now, you see officials and you talk to officials who you know sometimes are telling you something that's not true. You know that it's not true. And you know that they know that that it's not true.
Right, yeah.
But they're still telling these things to you.
Yep.
And you have to make completely different judgments as to how you use information. I mean, I won't take a transcript from any administration source without actually having seen the person say that, tape the person say that, or see a video of what exactly that person says.
You have to fact check the fact check.
You have to fact check everything, and you can't take anything for granted, which creates a lot more work and also really changes. I mean, I am currently, and for the last 2 jobs that I've had, have been a one-person Washington bureau, and I have to be very careful about how I allocate my time because I cover a lot of things. And I stopped going to White House briefings because I just found that it's an exercise in futility.
Well, I want to come back to the way that the White House, that's a good thing to bookmark, the concept of the White House briefing today and how that works. John, Kim describes the new normal, but really it's the new abnormal, right? There's nothing normal about it except for the fact that we've normalized this abnormal aspects of all of our jobs.
Right. And also, Kim, the cancellation of the White House press briefing.
Right. It solved the problem. Yeah.
Correct, cease to exist, basically, right? Yeah.
But yeah, there's no question. We've never seen a president like this before. We've never seen an administration like this before. We've never seen Washington run like this before. This is exactly who Donald Trump has always been. There's a thought that the presidency would change Donald Trump. Instead, Donald Trump has changed the presidency, at least temporarily. This is how he ran his business. It's how he ran his campaign.
Right.
As you said, I was there from day one.
You were a tabloid reporter in an era when Donald Trump was a celebrity, a fixture of those papers.
I covered him at times at the New York Daily News, just about Donald Trump, man in the news, so New York celebrity who weighs in on this or that. Donald Trump, Celebrity Apprentice and so on. Like that is stuff that we would care about to a degree. And he has not changed. He still cares about the same things. He cares about being in the news. He cares about generating headlines. He doesn't necessarily care if they're good or bad headlines. He just wants to be talked about. And we have had, as a news media, had to adjust to that. And we have had, and I think it has been a struggle at times to sort of recognize, like, how do we cover this? How do we accept that what he is saying, we cannot necessarily take it at face value?
Right.
Can we really fact check every word he says? One thing we get a lot is whether we've had, people have had Oval Office interviews with him, or we've had moments where we've encountered him in a pool spray, a gaggle of reporters, or a chance to talk to the president, whether it's at home or on an international trip. It's like, well, why don't you, when he says something that's not true, readers will say, or people on Twitter will opine, like, why do you not stop him? But at the same time, you can't actually interrupt everything he says. He is still the President of the United States, and you have to have a balance between holding him accountable, but also, like, he is still the President. What he says, to some degree, even if it's not true, is still news and has to be covered, but it has to be covered in the correct way.
Yamiche, you are, of the 4 up here, the one who kind of came from the outside to the inside, right? You had been a campaign reporter. You covered the Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump campaigns in 2016. But you were not a White House reporter until you became the correspondent for the NewsHour in January of last year, right?
Yeah, and I spent most of my time covering Bernie Sanders in 2016. So I covered the tail end of the Trump campaign.
Right.
And for me, I remember when I started getting into political reporting, I had this thought where I said, okay, before I was covering breaking news and hurricanes and natural disasters, and like this, I'm going to a subject matter where there are schedules and people know where everyone's going to be, and there's kind of a way that people are going to cover politics, and that's kind of blown up. It's almost like covering a hurricane every day, because every single day you have no idea if the White House schedule is going to change. You have no idea if there's going to be an impromptu briefing or an impromptu moment where the president's going to say something. I think I would agree with pretty much everything that they said, which is that you have to not only fact check everything, but I also think that media organizations are deciding what's worth fact checking, because you can't fact check everything. And I think now we're realizing that you also can't fact check every tweet. Every tweet doesn't matter. I think in the first 6 months, news organizations were struggling to figure out how to cover the president's Twitter. I remember back in the day, I never covered President Obama, but we all made a big deal if it was signed BO. Remember those days where we were like, oh, Obama really typed that one out. Like that seems hilarious now. Like it's just, so, but I also think that as someone who wasn't covering politics, to me, I've written a couple stories about this. President Trump, for a lot of people in this country, feels like someone that they know, either your uncle or a teacher or someone that kind of feels like someone who likes reality TV, who eats fast food, who doesn't always tell the truth sometimes, but who is still kind of popular and charismatic, and people kind of like to listen to him. I think he's a reflection of America in a lot of ways, and I think that we're all learning a little bit more about America as we cover President Trump.
Is there a difference, Yamiche, between the way you covered or would have covered a person like the president for print versus television? So we have a TV reporter, principally. I mean, nobody is only one thing anymore. You're all on television, for instance. But we have a TV reporter, we have a radio reporter, we have a print reporter, and we have a wire service reporter. So we have 4 different types of reporters. I'm wondering, is there a difference in the way that you cover this president, say, for TV versus for print?
Well, this, as you mentioned, this is my only president I've covered ever, so I've only been covering it for TV, but I will say that, I mean, obviously TV has restrictions on time. So one of the biggest lessons that I learned was just this idea that you might have 1,200 words in print to write about all the different nuances and things that happened. I think of we'll talk about what happened this week, this idea of busing immigrant detainees into sanctuary cities.
Right.
There's a whole thing that you can do in print where you have context, where you can talk about the rallies, talk about maybe even interview families of immigrant detainees. And in TV, if you have a minute and a half or 2 minutes, you really are covering, the president said, well, the news broke, the White House said that night that this is floated and rejected. They said it again that morning. Then the president said, he tweeted, actually, that's not true. We're still looking at it. And then he says, actually, in the Oval Office, we're really looking at this. This might be a really great idea. So you have, I feel like there's a little bit less context for TV because you're just trying to move things along. But you also have to be more efficient. So I think I love TV in some ways because you do get to learn, if the best TV reporters give you some of that context and some of that nuance while also making it short and sweet.
So Yamiche is reporting for everybody because the NewsHour is for everybody, and the wire service, the Associated Press and other wires are also for everybody because your stuff's going to run all over the country. So you're writing for a national audience.
Right, and certainly the biggest difference between covering for TV or print for me is I wear a lot more makeup on TV.
And fake eyelashes, maybe?
Once in a while.
Are you revealing secrets that we don't know of the MSNBC green room? Is that the... Yeah.
But I think that the AP, you're right, is that we're writing about this president for the country and for the world. Right. So there is a degree of sometimes we have to do it in a slightly broader sense, or make sure we rely on those context paragraphs that, because we want to be, it's not necessarily like a Politico where you kind of can understand like who their audience is. And they're read everywhere too, and Politico is wonderful. But they certainly have a Beltway-centric viewpoint at times.
You are writing for a mass, maybe the most mass audience.
I think that's right. And what we also do is that because The Wire has always been what it is, in some ways, we're more adept and well-adjusted to cover someone who makes news so immediately, the Twitter aspect of this. Since that's sort of what we've always been, is trying to move quickly and move fast and sometimes very brief if we need to. But even for us, the speed of this president, the way he careens from headline to headline, the way he changes the story so many times in a single, not just day, but hour.
Right.
It's not a news cycle anymore, it's a news minute. Right. A former advisor of his said that to me once that like he's concerned, he's not looking to win that news day, he's trying to just win that news, that moment, that interaction, because he's so certain he wants to change the chyron on the bottom.
And as you say, the wire service mentality or approach is perfect for that.
It is, but there are challenges too. I will say, one thing that we've come across is that, certainly we're moving, let's say it's an AP News alert, right? It's just 130 characters, whatever it might be. We're trying to just capture what he said. But sometimes what he says is not true. Or you say something, or he says something that requires that fact check. So that's been an adjustment for us too. We've had to learn on the fly that in that, we're trying to be fast, we're trying to get it out to the global audience as quickly as we can, but we can't just regurgitate like what he says, because that can be very misleading.
Now, Kim, your audience is in Boston,
Right.
Blue America.
Yeah.
Eli, your audience is California, Bluest America, right? So rather than these, Yamiche and John are thinking about the country, you all are primarily focused on your slice of it, and in particular, they're not Trump. It's not Trump country, Kim, right? That's it.
It is not. I mean, but it's also not. Massachusetts and New England isn't quite as homogenous as they get credit for. I mean, you have a lot of people. There have been changes there. For example, the Republicans they sent a Republican to the Senate not too long ago, and the Republicans who are challenging.
You just reelected a Republican governor.
Right, it's a Republican governor. You have a section of the South Shore of Massachusetts, for people who are familiar, is Trump country in a lot of ways. And the people who have challenged folks, Elizabeth Warren's challenger, who didn't really come close, but he was full on MAGA. So you have pockets of that throughout there. But you also have, one thing that is interesting working for a local publication, a local news organization. I keep saying publication because I came from newspapers. You think about how these things impact you. So one thing that this week, there is a town, Somerville, in Massachusetts, just north of Boston, which is a very vocal, open, self-described sanctuary city by the mayor. So when Donald Trump engages in this type of rhetoric, this type of policy, it has a direct, immediate effect. And you have people at the White House who will engage, locally with these folks, and you're really bringing those voices in. Or when different policies come up, a lot of things. We talked about healthcare. We talked about what Mitt Romney did in Massachusetts. So it's a way of sort of talking about the local impact of not what the policies and the rhetoric coming out of the White House. How that's working. That's my job in that. And then on the MSNBC side, it's a much broader, more analytical, with a view toward places like Massachusetts, but kind of put this all in context for folks who aren't within the Beltway, what this means.
And Eli, I like the analogy that the Somerville thing is great, because in the moment, your job is going to pivot off of exactly how what you cover affects where you are. You have sanctuary cities in California, Eli. The first line of this story about the president's plan was, we're going to dump all these undocumented folks in Nancy Pelosi's district up in San Francisco, right?
Right, and I think, for the LA Times, which is, happy to say, a sort of revived, growing organization now.
Paper on the way back up the mountain.
Yeah, we've added a lot of people and really trying to figure out what the paper is. And I think, it's in this spot between being a large regional paper and a small national paper, and trying to figure out which stories do we have to chase, where are resources best spent. It's not so much that when you cover Trump and you think, well, my audience is a bunch of California liberals, so I can really hit them hard here. Right. It is more thinking, okay, immigration is a story that really matters to our
California,
readership. So that's a place where we're going to go hard. And we've hired a person in our bureau in D.C. just to focus on immigration-related stuff, and the White House reporters work with her a lot. We also have an environmental reporter covering climate change. Right. So we work with them a lot. And you're really trying to figure out, when you're covering something that the presidency of Donald Trump is so overcovered. You turn on any cable network right now, you are going to hear Trump news. There's no room on cable news anymore for poop cruises or for, you remember that when the cruise ship was out at sea? That dominated CNN's coverage for, that doesn't break through now. Right. Because Donald Trump is ratings. And so you're competing. Everybody can write the same story about his tweets. And I think, as we point out, we do that less now. We've adjusted to that. Everybody can run fact checks and point out that what the president is saying is not true. And it's still important to do that because he is the president. He has the loudest megaphone in the world. And you have to point out when he says things that are not true. But you also have to look on this really competitive, overcovered beat. How do you add value? And that can be a challenge when you have a president who every day is throwing dozens of tennis balls for us to chase.
Well, and Yamiche, John said correctly that it's not even every day any longer, it's every hour or it's every minute. We used to talk about the 24-hour news cycle as an innovation. Now it's like a 24-second news cycle, is it not? I mean, we're at a point where nothing gets any hang time on television, on the front page of papers, and these are stories that in another era would have been dominating the news for days. They happen and we push them aside 5 seconds later. That's got to change the calculation, doesn't it?
I think it changes the calculation, but I also think news organizations are getting better at finding ways to follow up on that. Like I'm thinking at some point, I'm going to read a really good story, possibly, I probably might not have the time to do it myself, but there's going to be some sort of good story about what would the resources mean to take, what would it take to actually bus these immigrants to sanctuary cities? Where would that money come from? What would that actually mean from a actual functional logistical point of view? I feel like there's ways for us to follow up on that, and I think that's the power of having multiple news organizations looking at the same thing. I think there's someone in the newsroom somewhere across the country saying we need to assign someone just to that story. So I think newsrooms are getting smarter about not just letting the president dominate what we end up talking about. I think we are about 3 or 4 years into almost every week being about the subject that President Trump wants to talk about. And that, I think, as news organizations, we're starting to think, okay, well, how do we back away from that? Remember, everybody remembers Infrastructure Week happened like 5 or 6 times. And journalists were like, it's not Infrastructure Week. Like, it's just not. And I think that
Always Infrastructure Week.
Right, it was always, and the infrastructure has still not happened, right? Like, the infrastructure bill still hasn't happened. So I think that journalists are getting better at that.
Kim, has this change in the pace, the kind of Indiana Jones outrunning the boulder aspect of political journalism, is that about him or is that about it? In other words, if it were not for him, would this change be something we'd be talking about? Is this specific to him, or is this really about how journalism has changed, the news creation and the news consumption environment has changed?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. I mean, it's certainly being driven by this president who has completely upended the way the presidency is covered. But I think it also very much reflects on the news industry as a whole and different news outlets. I mean, I came from a daily tabloid newspaper, which happened to have been, filed for bankruptcy and sold and lost like 70% of its staff. And I was the White House reporter, and, we have no budget, we had no anything.
You're a one-woman show.
I was a one-woman show in Washington, and so I would try to do some of these stories. Hey, I want to see how this policy might work or play out, and I would pitch that, and my editor would say, that's great, and then Trump would tweet, and he'd say, go cover that. And there was literally no bandwidth for a paper like us to compete, and we were one of, I was at the Boston Herald, there's the Boston Globe, which had a whole bureau.
Right.
It was really hard to compete in that way, and it's a lot better now that I am at an organization, an NPR affiliate, that has a budget, that has a full staff, that has editors that will give me time to flesh out a story and really get to beyond the daily tweets and really get to how this policy is going to impact people. And that's been a real big change, but not every news organization has that luxury. And I think what you're seeing is a lot of people just trying to stay ahead, trying to stay on top. But a lot of good journalism is happening right now. I mean, you guys, there are a lot of publications who are taking time, you see the stories out of the Times or the Post, and it's like, after talking to 32 administration officials over, about this, and really gives you a deeply reported portrait of what's happening inside this White House. So I think it depends.
You make a good point. Eli, Kim's making the point that the economic distress of the business trickles down to the bandwidth and the human resources available to chase some of the stuff that might get you off of the treadmill, right? The Times and the Post are great examples, but they're exceptions that prove the rule, right? They're unusual cases. Maybe the LA Times will be another one of those cases very soon. As you say, you're hiring everybody that the Atlantic is not hiring at the moment, right?
It's probably a good place to be.
Right? But in the typical newsroom, the ability to do that is just not there.
Right, but you're also seeing, this moment, and I think television really plays into that because we're all on television several times a week, if not several times a day.
Right.
You see this sort of moment, and it's played on television, which is the medium that matters to the president. But you see on television, there's almost the celebration of reporters covering this White House, to the point where every story is played as if it's a huge Woodward and Bernstein scoop, and everything is Watergate, and you sort of lose this sense of proportionality. I think that's partly because this is aberrational in the entire American experience, and we're in this crazy cultural moment, and everything is shaken up, and so it's hard to sort of, in real time, make the right decisions as far as resources and coverage. But in terms of economic incentives, with the exception of where Yamiche works, we're all working to try to make money. We're all, you're working for public television, right. And a lot of days.
For public radio.
Okay, you're right. So two of us.
Well, actually, he's nonprofit also, buddy. I'm all in. This is terrible.
This panel is not.
You were this close.
This is. Okay.
It still matters, though, how many people are watching.
No, of course.
Sure.
If it's not a day that ends in Y, if I'm not getting corrected at least several times. But, my point is that on the whole, the economic incentives I've heard Jeff Zucker say, when we stop covering Trump, people change the channel.
Right.
And so I think that applies not just to television.
So in other words, he's right that he's the best thing that happened to the news in terms of
He is right, and he tells us
and
that,
clicks and everything
and
else.
I think that's one of the things that is hard. You want to go off and do enterprise. You want to not follow every tennis ball that he throws out there. And yet, I've been in a situation where editors in the morning will say, "Oh, you don't need to cover that." And then throughout the day, it will, the tweet. And then throughout the day, it will kind of grow into something. And then it becomes a big story. And it's like, that's a story that editors want.
You end up back in the same
place. And they
place.
want my name on it. They don't want John's name on it, right? They're paying us to cover the White House, so they don't want to take a wire copy story. So then sometimes you get, taken off of your enterprise story. Your stories are great. I'm just saying. For my editors. But the point, so the point is sometimes, even if you have the right intentions, I think the economic model for a lot of these my paper and everybody who's not on this panel, but it's hard to sort of, step back and say, okay, I'm going to do this.
I think we could also say something that maybe like the president is still an interesting thing that's happening. I remember covering the Bernie Sanders campaign, and you're working, like everyone else on the campaign, it's 17, 18-hour days. I remember I used to dedicate 1 hour a day to TV because I like TV, and it relaxes me. And then I would probably get off the bus and get to this hotel and have a 5 a.m. call time. So it's midnight, and you're looking at literally 5 hours, maybe 4 hours. I'd flip on the channel, and there would be a Trump rally going on, and I'd find myself just staring at the television, and it's not my beat. This is not something that I'm covering. I'm literally taking this in as a viewer, and I'd just be like, wait, what's happening? What did he say? And to me, it's that's just, it's the nature of it. It's why it's interesting. So as much as people can say, the president's being covered too much, there's actually the fact that even when he was a candidate, he was interesting. And now that you see a president who has so much power, saying all sorts of things. I remember when they were floating, taking away birthright citizenship. These are important, super important topics that even if they're being delved off on Twitter, it's actually governance. He's governing on Twitter. So you can't ignore the tweets either, because when you change the transgender policy for military, and that's a tweet, it's a big deal for a lot of people.
It is like that Twitter feed, a statement from the president. I mean, this is actually, the fact that it comes from him matters. You talked about 17 hours on the stand. I wanted to ask each of you the time that you're working, because we know you four from television, maybe first. We see you sometimes first of the day on TV, and we see you sometimes last of the day on TV. This is a very different job than it would have been a generation ago in many respects, but in that respect, what would you say on average, kind of snap answer? How many hours a day are you working to do this job?
There are days where you're working starting at 6 a.m. for a TV show, but even if you're not, you're up and looking at Twitter. You're up and looking at Twitter.
You're up watching other people on that, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, these days can be 12, 14, 16, 18-hour days, but routinely.
Same.
Yeah, you never really shut it off. And the funny thing about President Trump is that you get the daily schedule, and it says, the president has his briefing at 10 a.m. or whatever, and he has a little thing at 2. But by now that he does most of his damage, or makes the most news, when things that are going to be the most noteworthy, when he's unsupervised. So that's early in the morning when he's watching TV, or late at night. So you just kind of on all the time. You make plans to go out to dinner, and then you wind up looking at your phone like a jerk the whole time, because that's when he decides
to. Kim, you made the point about the White House briefing, right? You made the meaningless. The fact is that the mechanics of covering this president are both less structured and weirdly more structured, because you know that any time, as Eli says, a bomb could go off, right? A journalism bomb could go off.
Right, and that affects everything else, right? I mean, I spend a good amount of time on Capitol Hill, too, and in response to all of this, you will then have members of Congress who are, you know, doing things, and you're running around chasing them to get reaction or different things. So, yeah, every day you literally, in the morning, my routine is, generally speaking, in the morning, 7 or 8 o'clock, I'll email my editors and say, hey, this is what I'm working on today. And invariably, by noon, that has changed.
It's completely changed.
It's totally changed.
Right. John, you talked about the cancellation of the White House press briefing. That is abnormal compared to previous administrations, right? There was a little bit more standard way of operating in terms of the White House press corps. Is that a bad thing necessarily? Is access to the staff in that context overrated? Is anything coming out of those briefings?
I think that, I mean, the answer is we're always going to want more access to officials. So the answer is yes, we want the press briefing.
Do you have less access to officials because the staged theatrical White House press briefing is no longer?
Well, I think there are a couple of things at play here. First, yes, there are moments where the White House press briefing felt like it was being turned into a television show, where whether it was the press secretary behind the podium, or sometimes even some of the reporters in the seats, you know, maybe more than sometimes, we're trying to like sort of become part of the story, become part of the line, and that's not what those things are meant to do. But there are, you know, the Trump administration is sort of notoriously slow for engaging with, you know, if you have questions, and sometimes they can be very basic things like, what is this bill about, or what's the president doing tomorrow, things like that.
Noticeably slower than previous administrations.
No question, much, much slower. And, you know, and part of that is born from the press, from people who work in the White House being sort of afraid to get out ahead of the president because they might get contradicted at any time. This was a great example this week, of course, with the Sanctuary City busing example, where they said to reporters, this is not under active consideration, and the very next day, the president overruled them. He says they were. You know, look, the White House Correspondents Association is a firm believer in these press briefings. We feel like there's a chance, it's not just for us, but for the American people to hear, you know, their representative of government. You know, they're paying for that building, they're paying for that podium. They should be able to get their questions answered in terms of, and it's not just, it doesn't necessarily mean about palace intrigue, but like policy that impacts a lot of Americans, or international policy that affects the world. So yes, we would still like that to happen. There are, of course, other ways to interact with Trump officials. You get answers other ways, by other means. But I think the briefing, though flawed as they may be, something I think we'd still want to come back.
Yamiche, one of the criticisms when the briefings were happening on a more regular interval, because what's happened is there were sort of semi-regular briefings and then it sort of dropped off to the point where there were weeks and weeks with no briefing, is people said, okay, there's a briefing, so Sarah Sanders gets up at the podium, and then, some say, she simply lies, doesn't tell the truth, doesn't give facts that are usable in the context of traditional journalism. Maybe not having a briefing is actually better than having to do that.
I think I would echo what Jonathan said, which is that I in the White House Press Corps Association, White House Correspondents Association, believe that briefings matter, and that having a set time to sit down and have the American public hear the question, watch the administration engage with media is important. Because even if Sarah Sanders says something that's not true, you don't have to say, oh, well, there was a helicopter going by, so maybe she didn't really hear the question, or maybe, you know, there was some confusion there because there were so many people jostling. I mean, we've gotten to the point now where most of the information, as you see on TV from gaggles, as we call them, we've been saying gaggles, which is basically like a group of reporters questioning an official, is happening, maybe 30 feet from the briefing room. So we're talking to Sarah Sanders as she's walking back into her office, and we could literally just go into the briefing room and actually have a conversation. I think the key thing to remember is it's a lot harder to dodge a question if you, one, are sitting in an actual space where everyone has heard the question and everyone's waiting for your answer. Also, I think the idea that other journalists can follow up if Sarah Sanders doesn't say something is a lot easier to do in a briefing. So I think at first the White House press corps was getting, I think, criticized for not pushing Sarah Sanders on questions. And I think we started to see over the months and months and months that if Jonathan asked a question and it wasn't clearly answered, that Hallie Jackson would ask a question, then maybe I would ask it, then someone else would ask it. If it's an important question, then Sarah Sanders might say, oh, well, this is the third time I'm answering it, and maybe we'd finally get something that's a little bit clearer.
So there is something lost or something missing.
I think so.
In the disappearance for now or forever of this institution.
Yeah, just very quickly to follow up on that. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's the setting. It's these these wild scrums in the driveway where Sarah or whatever official is, it's much easier for them to dodge follow-up questions as opposed to setting in a briefing room where we can go after it. Now, to be fair, President Trump does engage with reporters and takes more questions from reporters than his predecessors. He does.
Well, the fact is, for all the criticism, he is more available to you all on a kind of a catch-as-catch-can basis than President Obama was, right?
No, he is. He takes questions in the Oval Office. He takes questions every time he leaves the White House. He goes out to the South Lawn, and Marine One's in the background. As you said, the helicopter rotor is going, so it's sort of hard to hear. But that's part of it. He takes questions, but he takes them in settings often, not all the time, but often where he's able to kind of just not do the ones he doesn't want to. It's harder to to pin him down on something because it's not in a controlled setting.
But it also makes it more likely that you can get a question. I mean, like I said, I will sometimes go when he meets with some other head of state, and there will be some sort of press. Those are valuable to go to because you never know when he will take questions or some other sort of press availability. Where you've all seen it. At times it turns into this hour and a half long thing. He'll get up there, start having fun, and then you might actually get to ask a question. I think that's important to know. It's also important to note that other administrations have not exactly been press friendly. I mean, this isn't a situation where the White House has been really open and responsive to the press, and all of a sudden you have these people who are shutting down press briefings and telling reporters things that aren't true. I've never seen this level of lying. But it was really hard. I mean, I'm a little older than some of the folks up here. When I first went to Washington, it was the George W. Bush administration, and it was fairly easy to get questions answered. Like, I don't understand this legislation. Can you talk about this or this policy that's coming out? And somebody would talk to you and even if it was on background, you'd have something to get a better understanding, fill out that story. That dropped dramatically in the Obama administration, where they switched to doing things like blog posts and other things that made them look very open and transparent, but they actually weren't really talking to us that much.
You didn't actually see him very much.
Right, no, and you didn't see him. I mean, I asked Barack Obama questions up to the lead up to his actually getting into office, and I never got a question to him during the actual administration. It was not really easy. So it's changed, but it's always been a struggle and a challenge for the press.
Whereas, Eli, you cannot escape President Trump. The fact is, you see his face, you hear his voice, you cannot get your eyes off him because his face is never not in front of your eyes. It seems like every day, all day.
Well, I was the pooler, the person who was the print pooler a couple weeks ago, and it was the day when he had the head of NATO was visiting, and so they have a spray scheduled during a meeting with expanded meeting, and so you think, okay, we're going to go into the expanded meeting. Nope. As soon as the president is sitting in the Oval with the director of the president of NATO? Secretary
General of the UN, right.
Thank you. Secretary General of NATO is sitting in the Oval, and we've all seen this a million times. The president has some foreign leader sitting next to him. He brings the press into the Oval, and he just starts talking about the news of the day. He's holding a press conference. He's holding the other person hostage. In this case, they're talking a little bit, the NATO guy, about burden sharing, but that's so you think, okay, he just talked for 24 minutes. He talked about immigration. He talked about all the news of the day, the Mueller report, et cetera. Turn off your tape recorder 24 minutes. You go back out and you think, okay, well, the spray, we don't need to do the spray in the cabinet room because we just did Nope, we're doing that too. And it's repetitive, and it's the same thing. It's like he sees cameras and he wants the audience. And, I will agree with the other three reporters on this panel that we don't want to see the briefings go away. I would say that my feeling is that's generally more for the next administration than the current administration, because I think the current briefings in their form, maybe it's helpful for the country to see Sarah Sanders stand up there and not be able to answer the same question over and over again. And reporters now are very good at following up on one another's questions in the room so that becomes apparent over 15 minutes or however long the briefing is, that there are certain questions she can't answer. But on the whole, that is an opportunity for her really to condescend to the press, to perform for the audience of one that is the guy sitting in the Oval. And we don't really get a ton of information out of it. And I would just say, we all want access to officials, to the president. Right. We've all talked about, if you get the president in off the record or you get him in a gaggle, keep him talking, right? You hear every reporter says you got to keep the president talking. Well, that is not really that big of a challenge with this president. And I often sit there and he keeps talking, and you have to wonder at some point, he's accessible. Yes, he's He's doing several interactions with the press sometimes in a day. But you have to step back sometimes and ask yourself, what is it worth? He's flooding the zone with the same talking points, most of which are untrue.
Right.
And so you have to question what the access
But Jonathan's
clearer or less clear.
Jonathan's point about he can answer the questions he wants to answer and doesn't have to answer the questions. The great illustration of that the other day was he was sitting, maybe it was with the Secretary General of NATO, but he was sitting with somebody when Assange was dragged out of the embassy. And he was asked about WikiLeaks, and he said, I don't know anything about WikiLeaks. And there was not an opportunity really to get in there and say, but then somebody asked him about the Masters tournament and Tiger Woods, and he talked for 2 minutes uninterrupted about that. Right. That wasn't really an opportunity, Jonathan, to press him on the WikiLeaks Assange stuff, because it wasn't really a formal setting where you could get a second question in.
That's right.
You can ignore or pretend to hear not something that...
That's a case, obviously, where his evasiveness didn't prevent the stories all written that he, of course, said, I love WikiLeaks every night.
Everyone showed the same clip reel.
Right, in the final 6 weeks of the campaign.
Right.
But yes, that is harder. He's only held a few what we'd consider formal press conferences since he took office.
Right.
Now, he does do ones with foreign leaders, although those have really scaled back too in recent months, the 2 and 2s as they're known, where it's 2 American journalists and 2 foreign journalists, each you get a question of
right.
each head of state. He is really, he wants to flood the zone. He wants to be on TV. He wants to have his image and his voice, but he wants to do it in the settings that he prefers. And those are often these sort of informal ones. And again, to his credit, he's taking questions, but it allows him to sort of to dodge much more agilely than he would if we were in a formal setting. And these pool sprays are great examples where he will, Eli and I were both in the pool in Vietnam, in Hanoi, a month back or so when he had a summit with Kim Jong-un, and we asked questions, and he answered questions about the summit, but when a question was asked to him about Michael Cohen,
right.
Not only did he refuse to take it, he then tried to bar the press from coming into the next event.
Or Sarah did. We don't. I don't know if she took her
Someone
orders
did.
from
Tantamount.
Yes, the administration did.
Yamiche, I've heard a couple people up here talk about lying, and no surprise, right? People have mentioned lies. Is it your job, in the context of your service as White House correspondent for the NewsHour, to fact check, to counter stuff that you believe or know not to be true? Do you consider that part of what you're there to do?
Yes.
Right. Can you? How would you grade yourself at doing it? Are you good at it? Are you able to do it?
I'm biased toward myself, obviously. Like, I would say I'm doing a great job. I think the viewers of PBS hopefully think that we're doing a decent job, because I think that between myself, but also between our anchor Judy Woodruff and the people we bring on, guests, to try to maybe sometimes deconstruct things that he said that aren't true that are more complicated, to really explain to people. If he says something like climate change is a hoax made up by the Chinese, maybe instead of me just saying, actually, that's not true, China didn't make up climate change, what I should do is bring on a guest to explain what this report from the president's own agency says about climate change. But I think it's our service. I think as a reporter, our service is to explain to people what's true and what's not. And I think it's also to make the smart decisions on what we want to pick out. Because if the president says 10 things that aren't true, but we find that 2 of them are things that are going to really impact the lives of American people, and the other ones are that, I always think about the first controversy of this presidency, or at least the one that I think of as the first one, was when he was talking about the fact that his inauguration crowd's size was bigger than President Obama's. So he wrote about, everyone wrote about it and we talked about it, and he still basically says it sometimes if he's in a mood.
Yes, he does.
But is it really worth fact-checking that versus...
Every single time.
Yeah, is it really worth fact-checking that every single time? Or even more, even now, is it worth fact-checking at all when there are other things that he said about maybe about transgender, or about the impact of climate change, or about economics, or about other things that I think, at least in my own mind, have a bigger impact.
Kimberly, as a viewer, though, I have to tell you, it drives me crazy when I hear him say something over and over, just as an American. I hear him say something over and over that I know is not true. And to let it go uncorrected, there's just something that messes with my brain, that no one will call bullshit on this. And the example that I always come to personally is when I hear him say, I won the votes of women in the 2016 election. He did not. He won the votes of white women in
Correct.
the 2016 election.
Correct.
And I hear this over and over and over, and he says it, and it often goes uncorrected. And I know that journalism, to Yamiche's point, there's only so much you can do and so many times you can do it. I must have heard him say it 50 times. What the hell are we supposed to do about that?
Sure. I mean, he says a lot of things like that, like how he's the greatest president for African Americans ever, and all these other things. He says he
I
makes.
suppose that's a subjective statement, although not really.
You're right. Look, I think it's true. I mean, if we spent all of our time correcting what he said, we wouldn't have any time for any other substantive journalism. I think that overall, journalists get a bad rap for not doing enough of it. I think we do a great deal of it. We were certainly doing a great deal of it before the election. And I think the election, a lot of people blame the media, saying that we didn't check this guy out enough or we didn't counter
Right,
what he
that
was saying.
you have
And
something
it was just
to
like, I
answer
don't know
for.
what we were supposed to do, because we were really doing that along the entire way. I think the results of the election evidence something different. I don't think it was people didn't know who he was. I think he was doing more to show everyone who he was than we could possibly do. But I think it depends on the medium. I mean, I get frustrated, like you say, you get frustrated watching television. I get frustrated sometimes on Twitter when you see, and I understand that there's the limitation of 280 characters, but you will see Trump says blah, blah, blah in a tweet, and it goes out, and I'll, sometimes retweet and quote and say, which isn't true. I feel like people see that and think that the press is just mimicking, where most of the time, even in that tweet, when you click on the story and you look, they give context and they say what is incorrect about that statement. But it's really hard. It's hard with the 24-hour cable news cycle. It's really hard with Twitter. There's so much information, and there's so much counter information and bad information. I muted my mentions a long time ago on Twitter, but the amount of times that I get people responding to me or making comments on my story telling me that what I'm saying, what I reported factually, is not true, is amazing. And I just think, how can people just deny the facts that they see in front of their faces? But they do. It's this flood of information and misinformation that makes really getting to that context, if you're not careful of how you cultivate your news sources, really difficult.
Eli, I wonder if it's a strategy on the part of the administration. Is he crazy or crazy like a fox? I mean, they know that they're lying basically without consequence. The consequences for telling lies that are clearly provably false lies, like I won the votes of women in the last election, are basically next to nothing. Well, so why stop doing it?
And they all, like management culture starts at the top, right? So if you see the president believes he's getting away with it, and that's his MO. Of course, the people who work for him, in order to please him and say the things, to sort of perpetuate his alternative realities, they say those things. And they also realize that in an era where people's own, idea of truth is completely subjective, that they can get away with that. And I think, in terms of the fact checking, that's just one of the things that we deal with every day. How much to fact check, and I think every time he lies, I talk a lot about these sort of self-fulfilling prophecies that I see around Trump, or that Trump creates. And one of them is with the press. He tells everybody the press is his enemy. Well, every time he's making these false statements, he's almost forcing the press into this tut-tutting mode of, quote, tweet, that's actually not true. And you see it over and over and over again. And what do we look like on the whole? We look like a bunch of arrogant, school marmish people correcting the president. And that plays into his whole pitch to America, that, you see these elitist, overeducated journalists, they're just always telling you that you're wrong. And it plays into this
Even if
cultural wedge.
you're right, the perception is that somehow you're not behaving in a way that's fair or appropriate.
And I don't think we can sit here and think like, well, if not everybody believes us, I guess we'll just have to stop fact checking. You can't be focused on what is the result, what does the electorate do, where does public opinion move after you release a story. You can't really worry about that.
Yeah.
But it's one of these things that when you're trying to figure out where to spend your energy every day, it makes it difficult, because you feel like this is really important, and you're also conscious of how it's going to be perceived, how it's going to be used against you.
I'm conscious, Yamiche, of Marty Baron, the editor of the Washington Post, when the president started hate tweeting at the press, saying something to the effect of, in response to that, our job is not to go to war with the president, our job is to go to work. Our job is to do more and better journalism and not to engage with this guy. It's got to be hard.
I think it's hard, but it's the job.
Yeah.
There's no other way to do the job but to do the work. I think that that's just what you have to do. I think the moment you start thinking too much about this being about you or your personality or what people think about yourself, you lose sight of what the job is. And to me, journalism was something that was outlined in the Constitution. So there's just, I feel a great responsibility. And I think a lot of journalists, people who get into journalism, feel a great sense of responsibility. I will say this, though. You were talking about this idea that the president says he's won the vote of women. I would say, as a journalist, there are a lot of times that I'm reading stories or watching people on TV talking about talking about evangelical voters, suburban voters, when they really mean white suburban voters. They really mean white evangelical voters. There are so many times where I think if we're going to say, oh, the president's saying women, we also have to figure out, well, are we also explaining to people what we mean by suburban voters? Because 99% of the time you're talking about white suburban voters.
Yep.
So I think that that's something that, as much as we need to look at what the president's rhetoric is, we should also be looking at the way that we cover politics in general.
Yeah. Kim, you make an excellent point. Does this question, Kim, of what the president says and how he says it on race, to pick an example? I mean, we have two excellent African-American women who are journalists. The president has attacked women. The president has been awful in many instances on the question of white nationalism, on race generally. Is it difficult, as one of a few women of color in the press corps, to regard this president the way you would regard a different president in this environment? Do you have a harder time depersonalizing it or being fair?
That's a good question. I don't believe, my job I see as being fair, and I think I do a pretty good job of that. I don't believe that it is harder for me as a Black woman. It is a challenge on the job for a lot of reasons.
Right.
One of which, you're talking about making these claims. If you recall during the campaign, for example, when the president was making his pitch to Black voters saying, I believe the quote was, "What the hell do you have to lose?"
Yep.
And then when he talked about any substance about Black voters, he talked about Chicago and the crime and how we're going to fix. So what he was actually doing was dog whistling to non-Black voters, saying, hey, don't worry, we're going to crack down on these crime-ridden places where these people of color live, and we got you. And it was when, and at that time I was doing commentary on television actually for Fox News, and I would point that out, that this was actually not a pitch to Black voters, because that's important when people say, but no, he's reaching out, he's doing outreach to Black voters, to say, no, that it is not.
Yep.
The flip side of that, though, is I feel like no matter what I'm covering or what I'm writing about, two things happen. One, there's a certain number of the audience, readers and viewers, who are going to make assumptions about my political leanings or views based on my race and gender. I am not enrolled in any party. I haven't been for a long time. I've covered politics too long, and I've seen how both sides make the sausage. But people don't know that by talking to me. I've done political commentary on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC. I've worked for a conservative newspaper, a more liberal. It's just, you can't really, I do the same job in all of those places. And so that is frustrating, because people will question me or assume that I'm biased just based on my race and gender. It is also frustrating, and as much as I enjoy doing television commentary, is when something happens. I happened to be about to do a hit when he made his comments on Charlottesville. So that was just serendipitous that I had to give my first take of that. But whenever he talks about S-hole countries, when he's talking about issues of race and things like that, I feel like my phone blows up asking me to come in and do commentary on MSNBC. And I get frustrated by that, because the news analysis, the political analysis of what the president is doing, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to go and talk about that. At one point it was funny. It was actually when the president called my friend Yamiche, said that her question was racist. And I was on TV that whole week.
I was in Mexico.
Everybody, she went out of town, so then they had to call me to come in and explain this over and over and over again about the president calling this Black reporter racist. And that's very frustrating to me, honestly, with all due respect to the producers at MSNBC, who I do like, because that's something that John should be able to give that analysis. That's something that Eli should be able to give that same analysis. And there is, I guess, because there aren't a lot of us sometimes, a default that
Right.
they will go to turn to us to do. The same thing happened at my old paper at the Herald. If something would happen, I would write like one piece and they would put it against Howie Carr, who was, this white conservative columnist. And it's this pitting against each other, or sort of framing it in a way that's like, I can do Syria analysis too. I can talk about that. I can talk about the Middle East. I can talk about 2020 Dems. It's not always. I don't always have to be the one to explain to the country that the president is doing or saying something racist.
The last time we were together, Yamiche, here in Austin, was right after the president referred to, among other countries, Haiti as a shithole country. And your family is from Haiti, right? You have, and I remember asking you at the time if you felt in some way different because of that in the moment, because you had but I guess we all have to depersonalize the news, do we not?
I think it's the way you do the job. I think the moment, and I think that this is kind of true in every industry. I have friends that are Wall Street bankers. I have friends who are lawyers. There are going to be times in your life as a student for people that people are going to say some things about you that not to be true about yourself, and you can't say, "Well, I give up. I'm not doing this presentation anymore. Or, I'm not gonna be with this client because they said something to me that I found offensive." At the end of the day, I'm there to do the job. I will say that I check my tone, and I have a small group of people, like my mom and other people, that I'll call if I feel frustrated. I remember when Mark Sanford, when we said something that to me I had to pause and think about, and it was when we were talking about birthright citizenship, and he said something to the effect of Haitian babies shouldn't just be citizens, and that literally is me. Like, I would not be American if it wasn't for me being here, because both my parents were born in Haiti. My dad still lives there. So I had to check my tone and say, like, do I really, like, is this really what I need to give analysis on? Maybe I'm okay on this subject, because to me it's like, well, what am I going to say? I'm not going to say, oh, well, maybe we should look at both of these and really look at those Haitian babies and see if they're worth it. Like, I think they're pretty worth it, right? So I think that, but I think it really is one of those things where if you're fact-checking people, there's a way to fact-check and say, he's an idiot, look at what he said. And then there's a way to say, let's just look at the substance of what this means and why he's saying this and why this is important. I think that there's a big way that you can check your tone, and I think journalists really should be checking their tone, because I'm not here to be a Black Lives Matter mole, right? Like, I think there are a lot of people who look at me with my natural hair and my afro and say, this girl clearly is an activist who just kind of wiggled her way into these news organizations, and I'm here to say, like, no, I'm not a Black Lives Matter mole.
Okay. Stated as such. We could do more up here, but let's get people from the audience in the conversation.
Yes, there is one here.
And Mallory, I'm going to let you all just tell me when we need to stop, okay? You just give me the Heidi sign. Great. Yes.
Hello, I'm Ivan and I'm from Montenegro. I'm not from America, but I have some question regarding Trump and our profession. It's two questions actually. If Trump says a lie, is it still a news? Because we know that a news has to be truth. And the other question is, if he tells that lie 100 times, is it still a news?
Right. I mean, John, we made the point earlier that if the president says something because he's the president, right, it's news.
Right.
True or false?
Yes, it is. It has to be covered as news. We have to cover it in a way with context and fact checking and sort of explain why this is not true or it's only partially true, whatever it is. But you also hit on something that he does all the time. He doesn't just tell a lie once; he tells it 100 times, and that's part of what he has always done. And it is what he did on the rally stage every night during the campaign, where he convinces himself, perhaps, but certainly his supporters, of a different truth, of an alternate fact, of a different reality. And they start to believe that. Because he's also painted the media as being biased against him. So therefore, he plants that seed of doubt in people's minds. Well, maybe they're wrong, maybe he is right. One of my favorite Donald Trump facts is, and this predates his career in politics, Trump Tower, his flagship building on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, he listed it as 68 stories tall. It's 58. There's no argument. It's 58. But he skipped 10 floors when he did it. It goes from like floor 2 to 12. And he did it just because he wanted to be, in terms of number of floors, the tallest in that part of Manhattan. And that is something he has carried over with him ever since. And it's our challenge to, when he does that, even though we know there are plenty of people out there who aren't going to believe us, we still need to be the ones to provide that fact check, that context, the actual truth.
Good.
Hi, I'm Sergio from Brazil. I can see like a lot of similarities
happening, what's happening now between our two presidents. They like each other very much as well. And I just wonder, there's some talk among Brazilian journalists, like how can we get past all the noise, all the lies they talk about all the time and just focus on the content, all the stuff they say that turns into actual action and policy, which matters the most, right? If he talks about 58 or 68 floors, it doesn't matter as much as building the actual wall and stuff. Like, how can you deal with that?
I mean, Eli, that's been a consistent problem in this administration. You all, I'm sure, done everything you can to focus on stuff that really affects people's lives. But the bullshit does tend to crowd out the substance, does it not?
Yeah, and sometimes you just have to deal with the bullshit. You had to write during the shutdown, after the shutdown, when he's talking about we're finishing the wall. We did several stories saying you're not finished, you haven't started it. You know, we had to get to people at, you know, the Border Patrol and to talk to people at Homeland Security and to ask for the actual data on completed wall and money spent and look at budgets and point these things out. So I think if you have to deal with it, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but as Yamiche said, our tone matters a lot, because if you're fact-checking and correcting, it's important, but I think it's important to do that with evidence. I think it's, you know, to have supporting evidence you can point to and say this is from the government itself, right. And also to do it in a way where you don't seem emotional about it. And just to say, look, this is the reality.
And I think Kim made an excellent point that Twitter sometimes is not the best means for you to police your own tone.
Correct.
Right?
Sure. And yes.
If you're correcting things, for instance, on social media or kind of on the fly, you can often you can solve a problem by creating another problem.
Sure. And yeah, Twitter can be dangerous. And there are some journalists who engage in more, I mean, I will do tweets that I consider analytical, that's not just the who, what, where, and some go even beyond that and really getting into advocacy or other things. It can be a double-edged sword, but I think at the end of the day, the best way to do the best thing that we can do is do the work and show the work. And if the president says climate change isn't real, just show the work, how it is real. If the president says something that is factually wrong, and also give analysis as to why he's saying these things. If he is doing divisive rhetoric, it's because he believes that politically that's advantageous to him, because that stirs up his base and that's going to help him win re-election. I think to explain and just put the facts out there and show our work is the best thing that we can do.
Good.
In the middle there, and then one behind you, okay?
Let's go from the one behind you maybe to one
hi.
on that. Yes.
You use the phrase that Trump throws these 100 tennis balls at you, and you have to go around chasing them. And I was curious, like, now that he's been president for so long, have there been instances where you guys have done something different and maybe outplayed him in his game?
I mean, I think I came up with others. I don't think it's mine. I think we've all talked about chasing tennis balls, but I'll take a stab at this. I think, the most obvious thing is his tweets. We all have the Twitter alerts on our phone, and you go back to 2017, we would have, at least in the newsrooms I was in, I think most that I know about, we'd have people who were on to handle early morning tweets, because every morning somebody would have to write up that the President of the United States is saying all this crazy stuff on Twitter. And now we just don't do that nearly as much. And so I think, whether it's normalizing or whether it's just sort of the passage of time, I mean, I think we're into year 3 here, and I think you just sort of get used to.
But you still have Twitter. You still have alerts for his tweets on your phone.
I'm sure we all do.
Do you, Yamiche?
I do not. I turn them off. No.
I'm like the exact opposite of Kim in that I bought an Apple Watch that buzzes.
It's even worse. Sounds worse.
It's actually unhealthy, but I don't know how to do the job. So I don't know how to do the job without being hyper focused on that, because if he's changing U.S. policy or if he's arguing with North Korea on Twitter, how do you not pay attention
That's
to that?
where he makes policy announcements.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I obviously look at the feeds, but I just had enough of at 5:30 in the morning being awakened by Donald Trump's tweets.
And he's also, John. I noticed today he actually. I mean, not just today, but I noticed today. Reminded myself today. He doesn't know how to Twitter thread.
Yeah.
But he's also weaponized the ellipsis.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Right? So he'll tweet about something and he won't finish his thought, and so there's an ellipsis, and I'm like, come on, what's the next? Come on, what's the next?
I mean, he's announcing a major change in U.S. policy, ... 34 minutes later, you're like,
What happened?
where are we going? But it's impossible not to. I mean, I get 2 alerts on my phones. It's Red Sox scores and Donald Trump tweets. I mean, that is, he is still, yes, we can ignore. We've all learned how to handle them better, but you still got to pay attention.
Do you think that, do you think he knows what he's doing with Twitter?
Oh.
Because as clumsy as he sometimes seems, so I went and looked today at the tweets with the ellipses. I was trying to find the second half of the tweet because when I went to his page, do you have, Mallory, that thing? Can you put that thing up that I sent you? I noticed today that the video of Ilhan Omar, where they've intercut the 9/11 footage with her remarks, I screen grabbed this. I thought he has now pinned that tweet.
Yeah.
So it's one thing for him to simply tweet this video out. It's another thing strategically for him to pin the tweet. I mean, I wonder, does he know what he's doing? Oh, he absolutely sees.
He does, and there have been, he has tweeted far-right groups in the UK and other places. And there have been times where they've tried to explain it away, like, oh, he wasn't quite sure what that was. But there are other times it's very deliberate. This is a great example. But he knows what he's amplifying. He knows what buttons he's pushing. And one topic we haven't really got to yet is the idea that he's weaponized us. That he's placed the media at the center of his story, of his campaign, in an unprecedented way. The idea of the enemy of the people, that the media is labeled that. Not only is that just an extraordinary thing for a president of the United States to say, but it's also a dangerous one. There's been a lot of comments about how her life here is probably, but he could be endangering this congresswoman with his rhetoric. But I think there are network reporters who travel with security.
You think he's legitimately endangering all of you?
I think that an argument can be made that is absolutely true. There have been violence against newsrooms, since he has taken office, and there have been people who have tried to carry out threats in his name against his political enemies, who at least have told authorities, law enforcement, that they were inspired by what he had to say.
Well, that bomber, for instance.
Yeah, exactly right.
Again, that's a story that kind of came and went. We don't talk about it. Under normal circumstances, that would have been a much bigger story.
Yeah. With climate change, the press finally decided we're going to stress accuracy, not balance. And I'm curious why the press doesn't say, I will not report something from the president that I know is a lie without correcting it. Why put things in that are simply uncorrected lies?
Well, some of it I would say is you have to look at the word report, because showing the president's speech on TV is quote unquote reporting it, but it's also stuff that's happening on live television. So that would mean I would think if the decision was made, nothing unless we know it's 100% true, we're not going to report on it. That means you would never be able to take President Trump live. Simply, you would never be able to do that. But the thing is, we would never do that because I think the American people deserve to see the president in all his essence, in whatever he's saying. I also personally believe that when I'm interviewing people. I was once interviewing somebody, and this goes back to the question of race. I was talking to him about healthcare. I was in Wisconsin. I was a Trump supporter, and I kept talking to him about health, and he kept saying, well, people think I'm racist. People think I'm racist. And I kept thinking, like, why is he bringing up race? Like, I almost forgot that I was, like, black for a minute. I was like, well, what could possibly be making him want to talk about race? And then I realized that, I forgot. I'm like a black woman asking him these questions. And he said, finally I said, okay, well, why do you think that people think you're a racist? And he said, why do you think black people don't like to work? And I think all these black women just love to get knocked up by these black men and then have their kids and be on welfare. I put that quote in the story as is. Because I don't need to tell people, well, you know what, black people do like to work. Like, see my byline. Like, no, I don't. Like, I feel like you don't really need to do that, and I really think the country deserves to hear this man say that. So I think that's a voter that doesn't have the power of the presidency. So I think that people deserve to see the president say the things that he's saying, so that we all understand what the president's doing.
And I don't think anybody. I mean, I take the premise of the question is that we're reporting what he's saying without correcting it. I don't think that we are reporting what he's saying without correcting it and without giving context. I think we're doing that all the time. I think even when his speeches are carried live, immediately thereafter you see the fact-checking begin. So I think that the press, like I said, I think we're doing a better job at it than we get a reputation.
Well, and some networks have decided not to take him live all the time.
Right.
And that's
Well, in fact, fewer and fewer are. In fact,
They'll say-
sometimes now Fox, I'm about to say, Fox is now not taking
Not just his rallies, sometimes the things of the White House, they'll say, we'll let you know if he makes
if anything
If
happens.
anything in the
Yeah.
news,
That's a way
they'll
to fact check
monitor
in real
and put
time.
it up, right?
Professor Alvis is telling us we have one more question, and that'll be your last question.
All right, you guys have touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about Trump and the art of distraction. Example would be last fall, we had the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi, and at the same time, Kanye West comes to the White House. So how do you navigate what the shiny object is and avoiding his sort of art of distraction in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. I think we as journalists can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think a lot of times when something happens and a big criticism is, well, why are you covering that when you could be covering that other thing? And I'll say, well, if you go to the website of my news organization, you'll see that we covered both things. I think when the President of the United States does or says something as the leader of the free world, it tends to be newsworthy, and I think covering that isn't a bad thing. I will, on the subject of that, I mean, I have written, at the time I was at a newspaper, I have written about Jamal Khashoggi, but I also wrote about Kanye going to the White House in the context of mental health and mental health policy, and how this president adores celebrity to the point that he was clearly putting someone in a bad situation, and with the White House as a stage. I think it's the way that you cover something and report on something, because those things do have, that has an impact too. Those things have consequences too. But yeah, sometimes he does things to distract. I also think he's accused of doing things as a distraction a lot. That isn't. When he makes comments that are seen as racist or dropping sort of these bombs, then they'll say, oh, well, this race stuff is just a distraction. What he said about Charlottesville is a distraction. No, what he says about Charlottesville and other things and S-hole countries, that's not a distraction. That's a fundamental part of his policy that affects Americans.
That's who he is. When somebody tells you who they are, believe them, right? That's the old... I mean, John, the fact that something is a stunt doesn't mean it's also not worth covering.
Right, and I think sometimes there are moments where it is clearly a calculation on the White House when there's a bad story coming to throw some smoke up about something else. We certainly saw that time and time again with the response to the Mueller report and everything that Rudy Giuliani did. Other times, though, it's not deliberate. It is just the president being the president. He's an impulsive character who is going to react to what he sees on television, and it doesn't, or whatever his advisor tells him, and it's not necessarily an actual plan to distract. It just sort of happens because that's who he is, because of his lack of discipline in a lot of ways. And I do think news organizations have improved, have gotten better at realizing what stuff we don't need to follow. Okay, this is just him being silly. But to Kim's point, it's 100% right. There's a lot of what he does is illuminating. Even if you feel like this is a distraction, it's like, well, actually, it is something that is worth covering. If he reveals himself, yes, write about it, believe it. Talk about it on television, whatever it might be. It is our job to take what he says, to provide the appropriate amount of context, the appropriate amount of fact-checking. But at the end of the day, he is the President of the United States. We can't just ignore him.
It's a great place to end. Look, we have heard over the last hour and a half how great these folks are at their jobs, and they are four of the most important ones doing it, and they took time to be here. Please give them a big hand. Acknowledge the fact that they're here. Thank you all very much. Yamiche, Kim, Eli, and John. Thank you. Good. Thank you so much.